Hi, welcome to Studio 14. I'm Ginny Sawyer, and today's show is going to be on marijuana. With me is Don Badgie. He is Deputy Chief of our Criminal Investigations Division at Police Services. Don, thanks for being here.
Hi, Ginny. Thanks for having me.
So Don and I, we have both been part of a long-running staff team working out regulations for both medical and retail marijuana. It's been quite a ride.
It's been a very interesting couple of years.
It has. I'll give a little of my impressions, but you want to run through a bit? You came on almost 18 months ago or more?
Yeah, pretty close to 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And so run down a little of the history of what our staff team has been doing.
Well, when I first got involved, we were just starting to get back into medical marijuana. We were talking about if the Citizen Initiative 301 was to pass, how we would go about implementing that, and what kind of implications that 301 would have, particularly as it further was anticipated that Amendment 64 at the state level might pass. And so our group, really not knowing whether or not either would pass, was preparing for the likelihood and what would happen if they did pass.
A lot of what ifs. And it had been a lot of back and forth because we had medical, we had a citizen-initiated ballot that then banned them, and your guys worked hard and got them all shut down. And then, as you mentioned, we had 301 and Amendment 64, both of which, as we anticipated, did pass at the same time.
And that created really interesting dynamics for us because at the local level, we were really focused at trying to get 301 implemented here locally. Mm-hmm. And while we were doing that, we had our kind of our long-range vision on how to go about implementing 64. We did have a little bit of a lag time before retail would be implemented in Amendment 64, but still had to deal with some of the possession and consumption-related issues of Amendment 64 right away.
Right. So a lot of our challenges, I think, as we've seen in our community, one, we didn't have a playbook to go by, all brand new and new for these business owners as well. And we have and this is a great thing, I say this as a real positive, a very engaged and a very diverse community that think on these issues. So trying to balance, I would say, health, safety, welfare, and then as well, will of the voters kind of piece. I mean, throughout this process, that's felt like a really tricky dynamic as we went forward and tried to make proposals.
And one of the things from a staff level that was difficult was this whole concept of will of the voters. Because Amendment 64, as you know, really had 4 or 5 different components built into it. And many people voted for one part of that amendment that caused them to vote favorably for Amendment 64. So it's really difficult for me to decide exactly what the will of the voters was.
Right. Maybe it was to just decriminalize possession. Maybe it was, it allowed for local control. And so as we've seen, the majority of communities have actually opted out. They're not going to allow retail at all.
That's correct.
We're probably one of a handful that have decided to allow that.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about how we're going to allow, because that took a lot of teasing out and figuring out. I feel like we've landed on something that's reasonable, if not challenging. Do you want to cover some of the specifics of how retail is going to come in?
Sure. So in order to do that, we have to take a step back and look at medical for just a moment. So when the local initiative of 301 was adopted, it laid out for us really a framework of how to go about reinstituting the medical marijuana dispensaries and grow operations. Mm-hmm. And so that framework we then think is workable. And so we used it then to become the basis for how we were going to move into retail recreational marijuana.
Rather than recreate a new wheel.
Exactly. Yeah. And so many of the options that we presented to City Council on this had to do with the existing medical marijuana dispensaries and grow operations, and allowing them, if they chose to convert and also become both medical and retail recreational marijuana. And that's the path that Council chose.
Yep. So we have, based on 301, we currently have 11 medical centers, storefronts They have some associated grow facilities where they are growing their marijuana throughout town, and those have to be in certain zones. And we're only going to allow those medical facilities that are in good standing, which means no violation type of things, to be able to apply for a retail license.
With just a little bit of an addition. So we have 11 existing, we have 2 more pending.
Right.
And so they would be lumped into that same group that would be eligible once they receive their medical. Those additional 2 could apply for retail.
They could have the option. So we've tried to contain it and not open it up and say, hey, anyone who wants to open this kind of business, come to Fort Collins. Somewhat limited in where they can be based on land use and zoning. And so right now, my understanding is of this week, we've really only received 1 application for retail, although we certainly anticipate more.
Right.
And each of those requires, and I think it's similar for medical and retail, but a lot of inspections and a lot of close look from law enforcement.
Both from local law enforcement as well as the state marijuana enforcement division.
So what are your guys looking for when they're going out and contacting these businesses?
One of the things that I think is important to remember is that even though these are local police officers that work for Fort Collins Police Services, they are empowered to enforce state law as well.
Oh, okay.
And so when they go into these medical or future retail dispensaries, they are looking at not only violations for state law, local ordinances, but also the rules and regulations that have been promulgated surrounding marijuana, both medical and retail recreation.
That book that's like this big?
It's a really large
Yeah.
book and has a lot of information in it.
It does. So that's been challenging. People have probably seen in the paper recently, I mean, we are levying some penalties, which again, I think is good. We're learning, and if people aren't able to follow everything, there are consequences.
One of the things we learned early on in the medical marijuana enforcement was that the fee structure for violations was not sufficient to cause voluntary compliance.
Okay.
And so as we went into the retail marijuana rules and regulations, we worked closely to come up with sanctions that were much more similar to what happens to a licensed liquor establishment if
Sure.
they should violate the law or rules and regulations. And so our city attorney's office has worked really closely with us and has been very successful at implementing similar types of fee structures and sanctions against licensed marijuana establishments.
So suspension, have to close your business for a week or 10 days, or you pay a really hefty fine.
Or
Very
a fine
similar.
in lieu of suspension.
Oh, okay.
And that's really the model that's been very effective in the alcohol licensing, is that if you have a violation, you as the owner of the business will come to you with a proposal that you can either shut down for a certain number of days, or you may shut down for a portion of those days and pay a fine in lieu of the remainder of those days.
Oh, okay.
And that seems to be a pretty significant and meaningful way to hold people accountable.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. So aside from the business aspect, 64, Amendment 64 also allows, so people can possess, adults over 21 can possess. There's some, I feel like, I don't know if it's misconception or, I mean, again, it's complicated, but people feel like, hey, marijuana's legal. But there's still some parameters around this.
Absolutely.
So for your, not a business owner, but maybe your average or interested marijuana consumer, what are some of the most important things for them to know?
Probably the number one thing to know is that the key age here, again, is 21. You have to be 21 or older to buy marijuana, to possess marijuana, and to use marijuana.
Okay.
Retail marijuana, not medical.
Right.
And so that's really the key is people think that it's legal, and in Colorado, you're an adult at 18. So does this all apply to an 18-year-old? And it does not.
Right.
You have to be 21 just like to go walk into a liquor store.
Okay.
So that's a key component. The next really big thing I think folks need to know is that you cannot consume marijuana publicly. So, for example, if you're sitting on a bus stop, or if you're in Old Town Square or in a city park, any of those kinds of public areas, it is illegal for you to consume marijuana.
Driving in your car, obviously.
Driving in
Sitting in your car if it's parked on a public street.
Yes.
That all counts as public.
That's correct.
I said driving. Let's talk about driving.
It's going to be one of the concerns as a law enforcement professional. One of my interests, and I know from chiefs and sheriffs around the state, is that we're concerned about the impact this may have on intoxicated driving.
Yep.
The state has adopted a level of 5 nanograms in your blood system as a threshold level to show intoxication. We've always had driving under the influence of drugs, DUID, and this just is an element of it that we think may become more prevalent.
Okay. So certainly it's illegal to drive under the influence. So I'm assuming with nanograms, there's no real roadside. You're taking someone in for a blood test?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Really, if an officer stops an individual and the officer believes that this person may be under the influence of a substance, they're going to put that individual through the same types of roadside maneuvers that they would with alcohol.
Okay.
And they're going to try to determine if this person's abilities are impaired by whatever that substance may be.
Right.
And then once that decision is made, then they try to determine whether it's alcohol or drugs.
Okay. Got it. Another key point, adults, again, we're talking people over 21, are now allowed to grow their own. But again, there are some parameters around that.
Locally, we've adopted some ordinances, really for what we believe are real health and safety related issues to home growing. According to Amendment 64, an individual can grow up to 6 plants, 3 of which can be adult plants. Locally, we have adopted that no housing unit can have more than 12 marijuana plants at all.
So even if I had 2 roommates, we're all adults, we could have 6 apiece. We can't have 18 plants in our house. We're limited to 12.
Under local ordinances,
Yeah.
yes. You also cannot grow in any kind of a dwelling that has a shared wall. So apartment buildings, townhouses, duplexes, all those kinds of things, you cannot grow at all.
At all. And you know, these were really interesting discussions, and I feel like I learned a lot from our building staff
Right.
around you know, just housing construction and the impacts and some of the growth that they've seen with, you know, maybe less than ideal electrical setup, shall we say, the prevalence of water and potential for mold. I mean, these really were pretty data-driven decisions on trying to protect people who may be heavily impacted should something go badly.
And it's also important to remember that a landlord, a property owner, has the right through their leasing agreements to regulate what they allow to have happen in their units.
Right.
So even if a landlord is renting a single-family home to someone, that landlord can prohibit marijuana growth inside that home.
Well, and I know as the city, we have frequently offered our landlord-tenant class and training. And even prior to any of this coming in, there was always that option of crime-free lease addendum. So yeah, property owners could put all kinds of things related to drugs and alcohol in that lease and hold their tenants to that.
I think there's really a desire to learn a lot more about this.
Mm-hmm.
As you and I have discussed in many of these meetings, this really is very new. We are further along into this process than others that are either considering or have adopted legalizing marijuana. And so we're blazing a lot of new territory, and I suspect that as we experience some of this, we'll be learning from those experiences and may need to make modifications down the line.
Right. So that makes a good point. So moving forward, a lot of sort of tracking. I mean, we can maybe guess, maybe anticipate, try to see, but we don't really know. From a law enforcement side, what are you guys going to be watching for the most, and what are your biggest concerns that we should be looking out for, you think?
Well, I think it's a matter of scale. One of the things that we're asking the patrol officers to be vigilant for and really looking for and take the appropriate enforcement actions is the whole concept of consuming in public. It's been made very clear to us through City Council that that's not something they want to see happening, and so we'll be making appropriate enforcement decisions when we find those types of violations. So that's kind of at a low level out
like
in
an
public.
open container law.
It's very
You
similar
don't
to an
see
open
a lot of that
container.
going on because we do enforce
Because
on
we
it.
do enforce it. That's
Yeah.
absolutely right. As you get into a little bit more of the higher scale crimes, we're very concerned about the impacts this may have on youth and taking marijuana into the schools. You've seen a number of circumstances around the state where marijuana edibles have caused significant problems,
Yep.
and where sometimes people thinking that it's humorous will bring a marijuana-laced food item into a classroom or into some other facility and not tell anyone that it's got marijuana in it. That concerns us a lot.
Yeah.
We're concerned about marijuana that might be legal to purchase and possess here being transported across state lines where it is not legal.
Right.
There are a number of examples of that where the Federal Drug Administration knows all, they don't know all, but they
Yeah.
certainly help us track that information.
Yeah.
We've had a number of home invasion robberies and violence that's occurred with guns and shootings and those kinds of things. And we're concerned about that level of violence that may happen around this area.
Will you talk a little bit, too, about the whole, and I'm not an expert in this, we're learning, but the whole butane hash oil creation and some of the dangers around that?
Well, I'm not a firefighter,
Yeah.
but I can tell you that when you try to extract the concentrated THC from marijuana, there have been multiple examples of that not working out well for those doing the extraction. There have been explosions and fires.
Yeah.
We had one fire that resulted in a death. We had an explosion here in town that caused serious damage to an apartment complex. And
That tenant was not home, right?
the tenant was not home at the time.
Was lucky.
Very much. And there are examples almost every week of this happening around the state. So it is something very concerning to both fire and police agencies about trying to not have those activities happening. The process, if done in a hood and with the proper ventilation, can probably be done safely, but that's not typically how it's being done in
In a home
homes,
kitchen.
in a home kitchen.
Yeah, so we really want it in a industrial lab almost type setting.
Well, that's why one of the things that's allowed under Amendment 64 is this manufacturing product
Right.
facility, and they should have the capability to do that without having the explosion hazards.
Right. So by the numbers, we have 2 of those types of licenses, I believe, the manufacturing products. We have, and I think this is worth mentioning, that on the retail side, Council did adopt and agree that any grow facility associated with the retail store, they can only move that product to that store.
That's correct.
There's no wholesaling out of our city limits.
That's right. Any of the cultivation facilities here, again, for retail marijuana, can only be affiliated with their retail store. One of the things we were trying to avoid was the Fort Collins area becoming just kind of a growing operation for marijuana facilities outside of our community.
Right, which I think makes sense. That's a lot of our rundown. I think I know that CSU is working hard to do some education of students, and in fact, again, as a higher education institution, they don't allow any marijuana on campus, even by possession, even if you're over 21. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And they can do that.
And I think that's part of the challenges for us, kind of in a not only a state issue, but also locally, is Colorado's being promoted as a marijuana destination. If
Right.
you want to come use marijuana, you can do it here. The problem is you can't do it publicly. And so it's really, Amendment 64 was really designed to take place in the privacy of your own home.
Right.
So if someone is coming here as a tourist to go skiing, to enjoy rafting or whatever that might be, if they choose to consume marijuana, where are they supposed to do that legally? And I think that is going to be an issue for us as we move forward.
Because I think the majority of our hotels now are all non-smoking,
The
so
vast
it's not going to
majority.
happen there.
Right.
Maybe if you're staying with a friend, but you're right, it's going to be hard to find a legal venue for doing that.
Which again is part of the reason why we've been asked to kind of prioritize that openly and publicly consuming, so that we can have an impact on that occurring out in the open.
Right. Well, as a staff member who's been involved, and I'm sure you'll agree, it's been quite a roller coaster ride.
It has been a roller coaster. It's been very interesting and at times frustrating, trying to kind of read the tea leaves of what's going to pass, first of all, through the voters, trying to address the needs of a very diverse and to somewhat extended divided community on this issue. And I think where we are right now is probably the best middle ground we can be for right now. I am significantly concerned about the ongoing issue about edibles and where that may take us.
Right, and so that'll be something to watch. So we are, as staff and city and community, I'll broaden that because we've got some other organizations in town who will also be tracking, but we'll probably continue to hear and revisit what are the numbers from our school resource officers. What are they seeing in the schools? Are you seeing a large increase in an impaired driving status? Are the violent kind of crimes happening? So that's what's yet to be determined. I mean, we're trying to work really hard together to minimize all of that based on these regulations, but there's only so much our regulations do, huh?
Well, most regulations and laws are based on voluntary compliance.
Yeah.
You can't have an enforcement officer on every corner. We have to rely on people to make good decisions and good judgments, as well as the concept of voluntary compliance. And I think if our rules and regulations are reasonable, most people will try to comply with that.
That's what I'm hoping. And then we have yet to see, I'm sure this is a flip side that people wonder about, and it's talked about so much, but the tax revenues. Some people are all for that, some people aren't so much. We've had some projections come in, but I feel like we need probably a year to really see what those come in at.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It's going to be very difficult to see. I think there's going to be a peak in sales and revenue, and then it's going to level out at some point below that peak once it becomes more normalized.
Right.
And it will probably take a year or 18 months for us to know what that's going to be.
And see, and it's going to take us a while before we get retail stores up and running, I feel like. We're asking those folks to apply at the state first, and then apply with us, and so we've got to see what comes.
Right.
So, Don, thank you. It is crazy times. Thanks for joining us today. If you have questions, contact the city. Let us know. But our main rules: no public consumption, no more than 12 plants in a house, and as with any substance, no driving impaired. So. Thanks for joining us.